Thank you everybody for coming to the opening weekend of Art, Love and Life, Ethel Carrick and E. Phillips Fox. My name is Angela Goddard. I'm the curator of Australian Arts in 1975, and I've put this exhibition together with the help of my dear colleagues, two of which are here with me today. And on my right is Anne Carter, who is the conservator of paintings here at the gallery. And on my left is Dr. Juliette Pearce, who's contributed an excellent chapter to the catalogue on costume and fashion within the Fox's works, but has also kind of worked more widely in this the context of this period in Australian art. So we thought that we would do a bit of a slideshow and talk about some of the issues that have come up. Firstly, with in terms of the conservation of some of the works and the preparation of the exhibition, things that we thought that you might find interesting, and also some of the other issues, particularly relating to Juliette's essay in the catalogue and drawing out some narratives between the paintings in the exhibition. Okay, so I have the clicker and I will click to the first slide, which is a really interesting one because we reattributed a painting during the preparation of the show. This little market scene was originally in our collection as an E. Phillips Fox painting, and is in fact signed on the bottom left, E. Phillips Fox. You can quite see that that's a blown up image. So, but throughout the course of seeing this painting, we thought that we would have a closer look, and perhaps, Anne, you might want to talk about some of the process that you went through in terms of looking at the work.
Yeah, well, this little work hadn't had much attention before in the collection. It was quite dirty. It's a typical small painting. A lot of these paintings are the same size, and they're on boards. And essentially the boards are beveled at the back, and at first we thought, perhaps they were like drawer bottoms or some sort of furniture that the artists found when they were travelling. But it does seem like they're actually purchased artist boards. And I guess what's interesting about Ethel and Emmanuel is that they were working, living and painting together. So technically, it's very difficult, I guess, from a scientific point of view, to find much difference in their technique and their materials. So when we were looking at this work, I guess we were really trying to... There is information, or more information about Emmanuel's painting techniques than there is about Ethel's. But when I started looking at this work, it was really to see whether there was anything that might differentiate them. And really, I guess we didn't find much that in these little sketches here might differentiate an Ethel from Emmanuel. We did find some differences in the paint. Emmanuel, should I call him Emmanuel? Is that a bit too personal? No, okay.
Personal.
As long as it's not Manny. It's interesting, the whites that were available at the time, Emmanuel seemed to be using a lot of zinc white, but in this painting here we did find lead white. And it's difficult to see from the slide, but maybe if you do have a close look at the painting on display, you can see that there are some tiny little, well, we'll call them protrusions, but they really look like tiny little particles of sand almost. And you can see them, well, they are most obvious in the dark areas. And they're actually what's called lead soap, and that's where the lead in the paint is having a reaction with the oil and forming solid little particles that are coming up to the surface of the paint. And it's a very common phenomenon. It's found in paintings throughout history. But we haven't seen that on any of Emmanuel's works. We have seen a similar thing happen with the zinc. But that was one of the differences that we saw with this painting. And I guess in terms of the attribution, really, if there's not much that you can distinguish them scientifically, but there was nothing to rule out that, this could be by Ethel. And so Angela's research, I guess, was put to the fore, and some decisions were made.
I think that it's true, and even the painting was signed. I think one should never use a signature, in isolation as an indicator of the authenticity or otherwise, or the attribution of a work. I think you have to definitely, in all cases, look further. And we did also decide to leave the signature on the work. We could have kind of covered it over with watercolour or changed it, or or actually made the frame cover it in some cases. But we thought that we might leave it, that it was interesting for audiences to think about that, and to kind of, that as knowledge, kind of moves forward in terms of being able to analyse these works, that's something that people actually would be really interested in.
And I guess one thing is that the signature was definitely put on when the paint was very dry and hard, so it wasn't. It's not scratched into the wet paint, or it's not a part of the wet paint. It's definitely been put on at some time later.
Do you want to talk about the techniques of some of the other works that you were looking at in terms of?
Yeah, well, I guess
work?
maybe if we move to the...
It's more similar in subject matter to this work, which is also in the exhibition. Yes, Anne?
Can I just ask you what's your idea about who signed when?
Yeah, there's been a bit of kind of, I suppose, oral history in terms of perhaps that Ethel Carrick might have signed some of E. Phillips Fox's paintings after his death. I mean, he died very suddenly, that she could have signed them. It's hard to tell. I don't think that you can be, when you're looking at, I don't think that you can, as I said before, I don't think that you can use a signature as the indication of...
Because, of course, yes, the signature, particularly given, say, the last 40 years of the art market, that for many years Emmanuel's works were traded at a higher value than Ethel's. Ethel's are coming up, so there would be a very duplicitous reason to put that signature on, but on the other hand, there is this quite a well-documented oral history that Ethel may have signed works. They had a lot of works. She may have signed works ready for exhibition, but she herself also could technically sign as Ethel Phillips Fox, E. Phillips Fox too, and she sometimes did use that signature is used by Ethel, and she often is described in the press, particularly as when she was a widow, Mrs. E. Phillips Fox. So technically, as all the brothers took the name Phillips Fox as a hyphenated surname, she could technically have actually signed that as E. Phillips Fox, and then a later generation, with an eye on not just the monetary value but the greater esteem value of Emmanuel's works, would have then assumed it was Emmanuel Phillips Fox. So it could be duplicitous, it could just be happenstance.
It's very interesting. You can see the conundrums that are, raised here. But Anne looked very closely at this work.
Yes, well, this is it's a very beautiful little work on the beach, and I guess when we were looking at Marketplace, and this is one of the other works that came in quite early to sort of compare Ethel's technique. And I guess what's so striking about her technique is that she's a very efficient painter. It's very direct impasto, and it's a very difficult skill to do that. The works, they're not overworked. She's put the colours down. They must already be mixed on the palette, and I guess she must use a bunch of different brushes. They're not muddy. There are some details of this.
Do you want to step through?
So just some of the things I noticed when looking at the painting is that there is dirt stuck in the paint. So I guess these are photographs taken under the microscope, so they're probably about 20 times or so. But you can see that those little particles, it doesn't look like sand, more like dirt, but she might have been painting and I guess the wind blew and you get a little dusting of dirt. So I guess that indicates that they were done outdoors, possibly in front of the subject. This is another detail just showing the use of how she left the board. I don't know if it's a pointer. So you can see this area here is the raw board. She didn't prepare the boards. There might have been a size layer, but there's definitely sort of no white priming. And this board layer, the colour becomes a part of the image. And I guess one of the things that happens, a lot of these paintings, both Emmanuel and Ethel's, and I'll talk a bit more about this later when I talk about cleaning one of Emmanuel's paintings, but they were very modern painters in that they weren't really putting a final varnish coat on their works. And what a varnish coat does to the wood, you can imagine, it's like dry concrete. when it gets wet. So putting a varnish on is like, a wet concrete. So it becomes much darker. And so you can imagine that all the tones become changed when these paintings are varnished. This is just a detail, just again showing the efficiency of the brushstroke. And when you have a look at this painting in the exhibition, I think it's amazing that these are tiny little single brushstrokes of nuances of colours, but you can really get a sense of even the personality of this person. Walking along in the background of the beach. I mean, she looks like a tall, skinny spinster. That's So, and this, I think, The other thing, I mean, Ethel, a lot of her, the figures don't have any facial features, and it's quite amazing to give that amount of sort of personality to people without any facial features. But again, in this painting, if you look closely, the little baby does have some googly eyes there. And this is just showing that although most of the work seems to be a wet and wet technique, so done directly in one sitting, there are examples of where some dry paint is brushed over the already formed. You can see that when the paint dries, it forms these impasto, and when it's wet and wet, it all kind of melds into one. But here you can see a brushstroke of red popped over the paint when the painting underneath was dry. So, she must have gone back to the studio and added to the paintings. And this is just a detail of the hat on the girl in the front, and just again showing the amazing the wet and wet technique and the beautiful colours. There's a gorgeous green, which I can't really see here, but in the brim of the hat. So that's just looking at that little one painting.
Did you want to talk about resting now?
Yeah. So this is a painting from the Queensland Art Gallery collection, Resting. I don't know who it is, but you might know that.
As in the subject?
Yeah.
Oh, that's another interesting question.
That's another interesting conundrum too, about who these ladies are, because there are persistent stories. Shall I talk about that?
Yeah.
Yes, and we slightly touched upon it, and I think we sort of didn't have much time to go into that. And there was some of the side stories relate to paintings that aren't in the exhibition. So what I ended up publishing about it was more related to the works in the exhibition. But there has been a lot of discussion about who the nudes were. And there is some oral history evidence, which Dr. Ruth Zubens kindly volunteered to Angela, which was very generous of her, which clarified. She had a oblique reference in her E. Phillips Fox book to the fact that Ethel sat for some of the nudes. And there's then the other major Fox scholar of the late 20th century, Mary Eagle, sort of jumped upon this and said, it's absolutely impossible. Neither Ethel Carrick nor Edith Anderson from Brisbane, the artist, neither of them would have sat for the nudes. It was totally sort of socially unacceptable, and there is one letter in which they discuss using professional models. However, Ethel did tell people at the time, one of her pupils, Alfreda Markovich, recalled, and in the 1970s spoke to Ruth and said that Ethel certainly sat for some of the nudes. Also, Frances Payne, a Brisbane modernist artist, very highly regarded in the 20s and 30s. She also talked to Ruth in the late 1960s, just when there were more people around who knew Fox and Carrick, and she also said that Ethel had told her she'd posed for some of the nudes. We certainly know the nudes are of the type, just like Rossetti, there's a certain E. Phillips Fox woman, and Ethel,
She loved redheads.
Redheads, tall, statuesque. Ethel wasn't entirely a full redhead, but she was sort of golden tending to red, and he does paint her often as a redhead. So she certainly was part of his ambience of his ideal woman, as was Edith Anderson. There's a lot of discussion about the fact that some of the figures that Fox painted and different people of the era recall this. Fox's sister-in-law, but also Ethel talks about the fact that any given figure could be 3 or 4 people that he synthesised. This is particularly what the academic artists did, and there was a whole culture in Paris that there were certain women who were known for their beautiful hands, for their feet, for their bodies. Someone had beautiful breasts. someone had beautiful buttocks. Sometimes there were girls who had everything, who were painted, but often a lot of the academic artists, particularly the less, not so much the modernists, who would, just like plein air painting, would have a single woman and paint from her, which possibly made things such as Manet's Olympia very scandalous. But a lot of the academic artists could have several women or several men sitting for a particular figure, and they would employ people on account of what they were specialised in, and people could make, models could have quite a reputation for certain parts of their body, certain things being particularly graceful, and they would often even deploy those models perhaps if they had a portrait, and you'd have the actual sitter's head, but you might have another body model modelling in. And this even happens, of course, in Hollywood. They talk about body doubles and things like that. So this synthesis of people to make an ideal woman is very, very academic. And again, it's a difference from Ethel going out, observing people in the marketplace, observing people on the beach and painting, and even the more informal beach paintings of E. Phillips Fox. But the set pieces tend to be possibly synthesis of particular women who he admired. But certainly the colourings there and often the proportions, I think, are very much like Ethel or Edith. And the other interesting thing is there's a portrait of Edith Anderson with a little black dog on her lap. And you notice the nude in the garden has the same little black dog beside her. And either that's Ethel's dog or Emmanuel's dog, or it's Edith's dog. So it suggests that nude, the woman who posed or someone who posed for part of that nude, knew that dog. The dog was friendly with her. So it was either Emmanuel's dog or it was Edith's dog. So there is a sort of sense of an intimacy. And I think the other interesting thing is that they're not girly nudes. It's part of this domestic. They are nudes that are sensuous. They are about an engagement with women. But there's something about Phillips Fox's fascination with women, which is, I think, is very touching. There's a transparency of his love of women, dressed, undressed, also women as mothers, women as homemakers, from the woman serving tea in lamplight to the woman teaching her daughter to read. There's a sort of healthy continuum. His women are not sort of femme fatales. They're not like Tucker's women. They're not being attacked for their sexuality. There's it's not a prurience, his interest in female bodies, and it's quite sexy. There's an interest in certain, like the fact he paints the pubic hairs and certain sort of the way he poses them is quite lascivious, and at the same time there's a sort of admiration. There's no scorn in it. There's definite, almost full-blown love and admiration, and almost a worship of the female form. It's quite moving. And when the nudes were first seen together in Ruth Zubin's show, that was a real revelation. But I knew an artist, Charles Bush, an artist of the 40s and 50s in Melbourne, who used to buy a lot of paintings in junk shops and things like that, and he had several of these astonishing Fox nudes.
Okay, well, and maybe from talking about the
astonishing Fox nudes.
Yes, we can talk about the more practical aspects of cleaning this nude in particular.
Yes, well, this painting, when considering it for exhibition, it always sort of had issues. It was always quite difficult to read. It had a very shiny surface coating on it, so when you looked at it, there was a lot of specular light. But it also had, some sort of discoloured coating over the top of it, so that it read really sort of, quite two-dimensional. So I did, it's a difficult painting. It had been looked at probably for the past 20 years, really, in consideration for cleaning, but no one had ever really found a way to clean the painting. And I guess generally, often with paintings, there are a couple of layers of dirt that might be on the surface. One of the layers might just be, dirt, airborne, dirt from the last, X number of years that are on it, and we can clean that off with, water-based sort of materials. And then there could also be a resin layer, like a varnish on that, and varnishes, we know, go very yellow and they discolour over time. And the research that's been undertaken on Emmanuel's paintings is that, as I said before, he was a very modern painter. He, like many of the painters of his era, were interested in what's, I guess, talked about now as the matte aesthetic. So they were quite anti-establishment in a way. And they were interested in surfaces that were not glossy and slick like traditional academic painting. And they also knew they were very interested in colour, and they knew that putting a varnish over their paintings would discolour, it would go yellow, and that would make the blues go quite green, it would make the whites go yellow. So we know that he was not an artist who wanted a shiny surface on his painting. And again, when you go into the exhibition, you'll see that all the paintings do have a various level of gloss. Some of them are quite specular. And last night at the opening, I did talk to a woman who was fascinated by the little. She said that she thought the painting, it's the Western Australian painting. He loves me not, I think. And she thought that someone had actually put silver dust on that painting because it has quite a strong canvas weave, and the light was bouncing off the shiny varnish on that painting. So I had a good look at this painting. We've done some analysis. We can take tiny little cross sections of paint and see how the artist has built up the layers, and also see what's on the surface. But that was pretty. That didn't give us many clues really as to what was going on. We can also look at the painting under ultraviolet light, and usually that gives us a sense of how much of a coherent dirt layers and coatings there are on the painting. And again, it was a very ambiguous surface, very difficult to read. So I just started with caution, and if you can see that this is the first starting cleaning, and this is pretty much just removing dirt from the surface. You can see a slight line here where I've started to clean from the left-hand side across. And I mean, I guess what's interesting in the last 20 years is that there have been a lot of advances in conservation practice. And it's always the case that if you can't do something safely, if you can't treat a painting or clean it, then you should leave it. And that's what's been happening for the past 20 years. But we do have new technology now, a lot of which has come about through advances in makeup technology. So I was able to find a solution to clean the dirt off the painting. And again, go back. So the way we work is with tiny little cotton swabs. They're just made up and rolled across the surface. And once I took off the dirt layer, then I was able to deal with the shiny surface coating layers. I mean, in a way, it wasn't a very straightforward clean, and there are still areas of it that don't seem to be resolved. Phillips Fox, he was also known to oil out some of his areas. Van Gogh was also renowned for doing this. So areas that maybe were a little bit too matte, might just get some oil and add that to those areas. But that oil, linseed oil, goes very dark and very brown. And if you look at this painting very closely in the exhibition, you'll see that in some of the areas of impasto, especially in the white sheet under her body, in the recesses, in the hollows of the impasto, there still is this discoloured material, which is probably an original oiling out by the artist, and that wasn't removed. I guess the decisions about what to remove and what to leave on a painting can be quite complicated, and this was one of those complicated paintings. This is just showing the studio. So this is the pile of swabs here, and just the solutions that we use. Often work in a spray booth with fume extraction, because to get the second varnish layer off involved using solvents, which we have to protect ourselves from. So yeah, that was pretty much what happened with her. Well, it's I guess it's taken 20 years really, but and I had access to a lot of the information that was provided before me. But I guess you probably maybe 2 or 3 weeks in terms of your time, the hours.
I suppose this is what often happens with a lot of curatorial projects, and when you get an exhibition together, suddenly there is a motivation to actually look at works and think about, well, if there are works that have problematical or compromised surfaces, that an exhibition or a retrospective is often a good opportunity for actually undertaking some conservation work. And usually most exhibitions in major galleries will often have a piece that's been sort of finally had some conservation resolved upon it, because, and as you're saying, there's so much problems with surfaces and previous conservation practices, which have often not been as well researched and as empathetic as modern conservation is.
But I guess what was amazing when the dirt layers did come off, the effect on the painting, and this is a photograph that was taken pre-treatment, and you can even see in this photograph down the bottom here the line. So below the line there, it's lighter, and that's an area of the paint without the dirt layers, and above that there are. But what really surprised me, I mean, I guess when you before you clean a painting, you're supposed to have in your head, or we usually do, have a sense of how the painting is going to change and what effect the cleaning is going to have. So you really have a sense of the outcome before you start cleaning a painting. But this painting was kind of mysterious, and I guess when you look at the painting in this face, you've all noticed that she now has very rosy knees, very rosy shoulder here, and highlights in her chest. And it was quite astounding, really, when those became apparent. And it gave the whole work, a whole different sense. I mean, it was a lot less mysterious, a lot more confronting in a way, and she had a lot more volume in her body. And even when the highlights came out through the bed here, you get a sense of, of the architecture under the bed, which wasn't really visible before. And the other thing that I found fascinating was that not only did the colours become brighter and the whites become whiter, but some of the dark areas also became darker. And that can be because sometimes a shiny varnish, the reflections kind of just go straight into your eye, and you can't really see the dark colours underneath. And so areas like the shadow here under her knee, and also just the form of her tummy here, came out a lot darker, and the form came out much clearer. And also areas that he'd chosen not to sort of outline, like the back here, which people always felt kind of melded a lot into the background. He's chosen not to put a definite outline there.
Okay, well, we might flick through a few more of the... Yes?
I'm thinking that might be a coverlet or a cloth, because I can't see many, and we've also got Margaret Maynard here, who's one of Australia's most distinguished dress historians. I can't see any evidence of trim or seaming. I think that might be a coverlet or a piece of drapery. But I think it's an interesting question, because that purple is very much an Edwardian colour, and you do see it in other dresses in his works. You see it. It was the Tsarina of Russia's favourite colour, and she had a whole boudoir set out in that pale mauve, and a lot of her dresses were in that pale mauve. So it was really a very quintessential Edwardian colour, and it was also very popular because it was acceptable for half mourning, so it could be less dowdy than black, but it could also be seen to be in a state of demi-mourning. So if you were coming out of mourning or wanted to show respect for someone, that pale mauve was a very useful colour, but it was an extremely fashionable colour. So people really haven't changed. I would that homeware's colours we know today are very much tied up with fashion, and I think that continuum probably still existed in the Edwardian period. Particularly, I think it's also about the affinity that Emmanuel has with interior decoration, with drapery, with homewares, and also with fashion. So there is that, and the whole idea of the interior as the woman, so that even the furnishing textiles have a reference to the same feminine ambience. I think so much of his paintings are hymns to the feminine, and they're quite different from, say, Rupert Bunny's, and there's a lot of different speculation about Rupert Bunny. He has his sort of poetic elements, formal elements that he curates and organises in different paintings. Think of the Nights and Days of August. There's a much more tangible sense of the feminine as a gendered presence, I think, in Phillips Fox's work, rather than, even though Bunny and he share a similar fashion aesthetic of the Edwardian, I think the women are almost incidental. They're just as aesthetic objects. Whereas for Fox, for Emmanuel, the woman is never incidental. She's a real presence, and she's a loved presence.
I think we might power through a bit because we've been dwelling a bit on the nudes. We've got a few images here. This is looking at the conservation process of all of the works coming in for the exhibition. Very exciting point for me, seeing them all. But we might power through these a bit, Anne, and get through to some of Juliet's images. But if here we had several frames were made up for many of the works in the exhibition, including this work, the Casbah Tangiers, which you'll see in the North African group of works. That's the rear of this painting. Don't get to see the backs of the paintings very often, do you? As well as Ethel Carrick-Fox's Flower Market France, which had this is the back of that painting. You can see here the beveled board that many of those small sketches were painted on, which would have been a lot cheaper, wouldn't they, than canvases, Anne, and perhaps a lot more portable because they're quite small.
Whole history. This is why people like the backs of paintings. We've got a whole history of labels. We've got the older one with the decorative border and the beveled edges, and it says, I think it says Ethel Carrick and W or
65
Mrs. W.
Boulevard,
Yeah.
Arago.
Yes, it's got
their
her
address.
name, and then you've also got a 1970s label from the time when it was acquired by a regional gallery in Victoria. So you've got even the typography of the labels. Firstly, you've got her address and a much older label. Then you have one of, say, 60, 70 years later of when it's acquired in a public collection. And then you've got various registration numbers and things like that. So this is why curators and conservators and also scrupulous dealers and collectors are very fascinated by the rear, because the rear can tell you a lot about the life of a painting.
And we also see the Queensland Art Gallery exhibition label here of the work coming into our exhibition. Okay, so I thought that we might move through to Juliet's work because we want to keep moving, and some of the themes that you discussed through your essay, Juliet.
Yes, because I was very grateful for the opportunity to be able to write on these works given to me by the Queensland Art Gallery, because while I think there's a tremendous interest, public interest in dress shows and shows of historic costume in Australia, because with many institutions, National Gallery of Victoria, National Gallery in Canberra and Queensland Art Gallery, they put on a major fashion show and you get huge attendances. You also get a different demographic. And so it's ironic, in fact, that the fashion show speaks very much widely to the community, often than certain more esoteric arts shows. But I think the interesting thing is that we haven't had the movement which has happened in the UK and America in recent years under the so-called aegis of the new art histories, when the history of dress studies and the history of art comes together in shows, and we have things. I just grabbed this off Angela's bookshelf, Women, Whistler and Fashion. We have a number of wonderful catalogues being put out in the States. This is an American one, and in Britain over the last 10 years, looking at artists such as Manet, Whistler, the Impressionists, and fashion, and academic artists and their relationship to fashion. This is the first time, I believe, in an Australian gallery we've actually explicitly in an exhibition catalogue looked at dress imagery and dress information from the works of artists. And I find it's a fascinating, costume is a lingua franca for the Foxes. It also tells us a lot about their interactions and their working. This one, of course, I'd long picked this up, long before I had the opportunity to write. I'd been sitting on this for sort of many years, and the same dress, that they shared dresses for their models and their studio paintings. And this also suggests that this is quite a formal one, the Kiet Denard, and rather than being an impression, it was actually, I think, somewhat more composed and more assembled than a lot of Ethel's works. She tended to be painting on the motif, but I would say things such as the Manly Beach picture, Kiet Denard, there are a few slightly more academic paintings, and I think we can suggest that because we have a dress that appears to be walking past is also seen painted by Emmanuel Phillips Fox. This long overblouse or tabard with the black binding is seen in a more formal context, painted by Phillips Fox. So I suspect she might have added that figure or added the dress to figures that she painted on the motif. So, but this also demonstrates that both of them use the same dress. And it also demonstrates the differences in their oeuvre, whereas Ethel's is about place, action, society. Emmanuel's is more about contemplating this almost goddess-like woman, structure, academic construction, and it's a much more close focus, a much more conservative and academic focus. Ironically, although there has been a discourse amongst historians to debase Ethel against Emmanuel, that Ethel is a much more modernist painter overall. Her approaches, her ideas, and what she's doing with paint and design is much more modernist. Emmanuel tends to be multi-streamed and has quite a strong conservative base. And this, of course, led me to looking at the synergies and trails of dress in various paintings by Emmanuel. And this, of course, possibly is the showpiece. One of the things is we can't necessarily regard Phillips Fox's paintings as being entirely fashion journalism because of the constructed and arbitrary use of dress, and the dresses appear in a number of paintings in different contexts. So we have very much the formal, the sort of mother figure in the lesson, very much a social occasion, very much a formal occasion. And it's also got a quite strong philosophy. It's not only Fox's construction of this ideal family that he longed for, and also perhaps a tribute to the strength of the mother figure in his own personal childhood history, but it's also, there was quite a lot of images shown at the Salon by both radical and conservative artists showing maternal instruction. There was a lot of discussion in France about the importance of the good woman to the nation, and the good woman, the housewife, the mother, then instructing her daughter in the right way to go. And there was quite a lot of debate even in public about education and whether women should go to professional schools, whether they should have professional higher education, or if it was better that they were taught in womanly virtues and domestic arts and gentleness by female instruction at home. A virtuous woman was the backbone of the nation, and she too could raise a virtuous daughter. So there's quite, in fact, an ideology there. But it's a sort of formal, respectable image of the mother. And he's almost painted, this is a loose wrapper or a tea gown, and a sort of like a formal dress, a sort of dressing gown type of garment that you didn't wear your corset underneath. It was a garment that women wore often to relax and to be sleep in, or to wear between changing for formal events. And he has made it more like a day dress there. And whereas you can see its actual form, which is loose without a structured waist, with a button-through front, you can see it in the reclining figure. This is not in the exhibition. She's at the Queensland University. And again, it shows you how the dresses come from painting to painting. But the one we do have in the show is a much more erotic painting. So we have the same dress being worn by the mother, and we have it discarded there. We can just see you can see the sort of very wide pink satin ribbon and a little bit of the insertion. You can just see a bit of the sleeve there. So we have one dress in three totally different contexts. And then there's an even more fascinating permutation. Next slide. And this is a painting in the Queensland Art Gallery. Again, the same wrapper. And similar to the slightly more formal furniture than in the woman resting, which is in the Queensland University. But again, you see the same dress, the same sort of sense of the sort of relaxing looseness. And these dresses were often seen as very sensuous because they were at a time when a woman wasn't fully corseted, a woman wasn't fully sort of bound up in her public role, and she was able to sort of, her body was able to relax, she was able to dream and muse. So it was often seen as sort of almost a slightly erotic interlude in her life. In both this and the previous one, the woman resting, notice the bangle, and there's a lot of discussion that in actual fact this jewellery that models wore was often something that they could buy themselves, and it indicated that they were economic players in the status of the French art economy. So it almost indicates not only a woman as a sort of decorated object, but as Tamar Garb, who's an American art historian, suggests, it also suggests that these women were agents themselves, be it in modelling, be it in a little casual prostitution. That, you know, it was she was wearing almost like a Middle Eastern woman wearing dowry coins on her headdress, as they used to do in Palestine. It's sort of almost a signifier of their sort of wealth and success, and a visual communication that I am able to earn my own living. I am an independent woman. So it's fascinating. You've even got the same jewellery. But another interesting thing is you notice the same sofa. This is Lamplight from the University of Melbourne, and you've got the same sofa. And I first thought he had changed the fabric on it, because he does change the fabric on some of his furniture. But we think it might just be a different light. It's actually is the same blue brocade, but seen in a slightly different, more yellow incandescent lighting than in the previous work. But this is a work I'm very fond of. Again, it shows you a number of fashionable garments, and particularly that dress with the black trimming that occurs in a number of paintings, including in the Ferry. It becomes a bit of a catalogue. It's in the muslin dress. It's in the background. It has this large detachable collar, and that collar is seen. What we've got here, we've got the collar on one dress, and then in the muslin dress, you have the dress with the black frills.
I think it's this one here.
But it has that collar, so they're taking collars off dresses, putting them onto other ones. So in the muslin dress, you have the same black trimmed frills, but you also have that deep collar. But this is it's a beautiful work, Lamplight. It's one of his key academic works.
And you're going to talk about that more in detail tomorrow, aren't you?
So, and another dress that comes between the two of them is this striped dress, which Emmanuel paints in a number of paintings. And we see this is a very fragile painting. It's not in the exhibition, but it's in the centre of the Ferry. But you see it occurs twice, even with a slightly different hat, but you see it again, the same striped dress. And that may have been one of Ethel's dresses. We know some of the dresses were because Irene Fox, his sister, who posed for some of his paintings, said that she was given Ethel's dresses, which they used for their paintings. She was given Ethel's dresses to wear. So Ethel had her own dresses, but they were also used for painting. She also said even her wedding dress was used. We have her first hat. We have Ethel, very rare first-hand comment from Ethel, talking about the fact that her wedding dresses were used in the studio. So it's quite fascinating once you start seeing the permutations of where the dresses go in the paintings. And it tells us a bit about their work and their life together. And you can find also objects, tea sets, the sofa, tables, tablecloths. So it becomes almost like a sort of fascinating sort of forensic discovery. I look at all their paintings, and there's a lot more to be said, I think, as they come out.
I just also wanted to finish on the small sketch of the beach at Trouville, which I was very thrilled to discover this in a private collection, because of course I immediately thought of our wonderful bathing hour, and that small sketch is a possible preparatory work for bathing hour. And Anne, I wondered if you might want to talk a bit about the cleaning of bathing hour, because as Juliet was saying, often it's exhibitions which prompt, major conservation treatments of works, and bathing hour itself was cleaned in preparation for the Met exhibition, American Impressionism and Realism, that we held here in 2009. And during the course of cleaning that painting, Gillian Osmond, who worked on that painting specifically, made lots of interesting discoveries. So I thought you might want to mention those.
Yeah, and I guess before I answer that, I guess I'm interested as well whether those little beach scenes, were they were set up, were they? When you say, I mean, if there are obviously the models' dresses there.
Yes, it's interesting. Where does the sketch begin, and where does the developed work end, or whether they did some sketches and then added, I think they might have added extra figures to balance the composition. But there's an interesting one is we do have some documentation on the fact that the sketches at the back were painted at Chelsea Beach in Melbourne, but the final figure the final figure in the front was a Parisian one. So for me, it's a major synthesis. But we can see if you look as a social historian, notice that boat, and there's certainly people sort of sitting in the boat. It could be men and women, because there are some people who have short hair in the boat in bathing costumes. That's very informal. You wouldn't have that in Australia. So there is this very informal sort of mixing of, you wouldn't have that in France, you'd have it in Australia, but not in the French scenes. There's a lot more formality between people's gestures and interactions in the French beach scenes, and it's not until the 20s do we see people lying on the beach in the French scenes in bathers. And so you've got, the background is definitely by Fox family tradition, painted in Chelsea, in Melbourne, and at least the sketches, and then of course he would parlay the sketches into the final work, which he would paint all in France. But he particularly was using his sketches. He repainted things. He painted the little boy in the arbour from a head study he did it in Australia, and then he painted the full study for the figure in France. So that's an interesting thing, but it's quite interesting what you see, that he's moved the group slightly so it doesn't interfere with her profile.
Just so that you know, the version on the left is the Castlemaine Art Gallery's version, and the version on the right is the Queensland Art Gallery's version.
And I guess I haven't looked much at the Castlemaine's painting, but the Queensland Art Gallery painting on the right is a very fragile painting, and it's a painting that we don't often send on the road. The reason it is fragile, again, is because Phillips Fox was aiming for a very matte fresco-like appearance, and the way to achieve a matte paint is not to have much binder in there. So he's used a very absorbent ground, calcium sulfate with animal skin glue, and then over that he's used oil paint, and he's likely also to have leached the oil out of his paint. I mean, Monet was known to do this as well, and Monet used to paint out the oil paint on some absorbent paper first to drain the oil out of it. So it's quite a fragile painting. I think when it was cleaned, again, there were issues of very inconsistent sort of use of materials. Some areas appeared to have been reworked a bit later with some varnish. There were issues with the patchiness in the sea, because there were areas that had some discoloured varnish and other areas that didn't. So they were evened out using solvents. And the other sort of fascinating area, I guess, technically, that the light falling on the figure on the Queensland Art Gallery painting, the way there is the demarcation between the sunlit area and the area in shadow. I mean, it's very difficult for our eyes to adjust to that level of contrast, and I guess that's one of the beauties of painting, that the artist here can bring to life those areas that are in shadow. And when this painting was cleaned, again, we expected that the whites would be very white and fresh, but his whites are very subdued, and that's something that we've come to realise about a lot of the paintings, that the whites are not bright whites, but they're often quite subdued. We thought that was just the case of it being dirty, but it's not.
Do you want to say something, Anne, about E. Phillips Fox's and the fragility of his work? Because that's something I think many conservators do comment on. It's quite notorious amongst Australian conservators, isn't it?
Well, it is a fascinating area, and again, I haven't done a lot of research, but it's renowned. I mean, a painting like the Ferry, which sits in one room, and it's people are, I wouldn't say too frightened, but it does, paint does fall off whenever you move it. So it doesn't get moved very often. And possibly in the past, you were talking about changes in conservation practice. In the past, that painting may have been totally infused with an adhesive from the back. There's a process called wax lining, where hot wax is just painted on the back of a painting, and that becomes the binder for the paint. But you can imagine that does significantly alter the look of the painting. So those kind of overall treatments aren't really carried out anymore in conservation.
That's only they were still carried out in Australia in the 80s. That was considered still 20 years ago.
The 80s are a very long time ago.
Exactly.
I don't accept it either. But
yes, in conservation years, it's a very
Yes,
very
and
long time ago.
and
It's almost a couple of centuries ago in conservation terms.
No, it is amazing because often those treatments, which are totally irreversible and totally change the look of a painting, were done, as a preventive measure. Like going to the dentist and getting a filling before your tooth has any holes. So, yeah,
It's a
but I
very
guess
very good analogy, because people used to have their teeth out just so they didn't have to have problems with fillings. That's
yeah, and people, I guess, accept damage in a painting or irregularities a lot more than possibly they did even 20 years ago. And there has been a lot more research into how a painting should look.
Including, and we should mention Catherine Nunn's chapter in the exhibition catalogue. Catherine Nunn is a scholar from the University of Melbourne, the Centre for Conservation and Cultural Materials, is that what it's called? Okay. She's undertaking her masters at the moment, and in this great kind of synergy, she was working on Phillips Fox in particular at the same time that I was developing this exhibition. So she's contributed a chapter to the catalogue, and she'll also be presenting more extensively on her work throughout the exhibition later during our series focusing on new voices, who Anne Gerard Austin, who is here with us in the audience today, will also be presenting on some of her research. But I think we might start wrapping it up now. And
I just did want to mention, sorry,
okay,
that just not to scare everybody about Phillips Fox, because what was surprising, cleaning something like Resting, I mean, it's a very solid painting. And looking at the paintings that have come in for the exhibition, there are some that are very fragile, but there are others that are very solid. So, he was obviously using different materials, and I guess for his large academic paintings, he had particular ideas about how he wanted them to look, and there are some issues with those, but I wouldn't say as a blanket rule that all his paintings are.
I think, as you say, it's that interest in the matte, that matte, almost fresco-like, neo-primitive feeling was very much linked to a modernity at the time. So it makes him again a very interstitial figure, because he constructs as an academic painter, but he also wants his paintings to appear with that chalky Puvis de Chavannes sort of very Quattrocento finish, which was a very much more seen as an avant-garde finish rather than the very highly glazed sort of luminous surfaces of academic painting. There was a sort of protest being made through that choice of matte surface, which is interesting.
It does make them much more difficult to deal with. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's a great discussion about some of the issues that we've all come across in preparations for the exhibition. So I thought we might throw to some questions. We've got time for a couple of quick questions. If anybody has a burning query that they want.
You're going to have to give it back to me in a second. I'm just wondering if you'd like to speak to the issue of the hats. I believe that Edith Anderson is wearing what was called, for costume experts in the room, a Merry Widow
Hat,
which
was the hat designed by Lucille, the famous Edwardian couturier, for Lily Elsie. So it's a rather large hat with a self-trimmed bow of sort of probably large taffeta ribbon, which is actually, in fact, is a little old-fashioned by this stage, because the Merry Widow craze, when that hat went around the world, was about 1907. Lily Elsie was the extraordinarily beautiful star of the London production. The first Mitzi Gunter, the first Merry Widow, was a rather more stout lady, but the first English Merry Widow was the one who probably popularised the piece around the world and made Lehar's fortune. And that was Lily Elsie, and all her clothes were designed by Lucille, and that is that hat became known as the Merry Widow hat, which is particularly that big, wide taffeta bow on the front of the black hat. But hats are very interesting in the Fox's work, and particularly because Ethel lived so long. And you can move to some of the 1920s pieces, and you can see no longer those very broad-brimmed hats, but you can see a much tighter cloche hat and the reduction of the millinery. You also get these very large sort of those very large sort of solid sort of conglomerations of feathers, those sort of pyramids of feathers, which of course at this stage a lot of those feathers came from the Pacific, from New Guinea. There was a huge trade of exotic birds from New Guinea and also South America. And there was even said that the passion for feathers in the early 1900s caused a number of bird species to be nearly rendered extinct, and there were early versions of PETA of women who were refusing to have wild feathers on their hats, and there's a whole international trade, including ostrich farms in Australia, that they actually farmed ostriches for the vast millinery trade, and of course also for fans and things. But yes, hats were such an extraordinary part of that look. And of course, because they're such good recorders of the costumes, both of them, there's wonderful details of hats. You also see men, mostly in boaters. And I thought when I saw your Friday at the Salon painting, and also the painting of the judging at the selection panel at the Salon, there are a lot of black shiny top hats of the respectable French aristocracy and the sort of academic knights of academic painting, but you don't tend to see those in the Fox paintings. There are very few black top hats. Most of the men are in their summer deshabille, so they're in boaters, they're in lighter coloured suits, and by the 20s, in the street scenes, you don't see the men in the silk hats. You're mostly seeing women or men in soft caps and things like that. So yes, the hats are fascinating, but I love those two paintings, the On the Balcony and the one of her in the purple dress, the nasturtiums. They're amongst the core pieces of Fox's oeuvre. But I assume that's probably Ethel's hat, and Edith's hat, because she wears it in both cases. But it is a little old-fashioned for that date, just like the dress in Lamplight is about, again, slightly earlier in the decade because of its waistline. It should be a higher waistline. The dress in nasturtiums is spot on for that period. But I also love the way that in both nasturtiums and On the Balcony, the black hat is matched with the black gloves. Beautiful detailing. And there's a sort of reciprocality about the styling detail of fashion and the wearer, but also the coloristic arrangements of the artist. So there's a sort of coming together of fashion and art, I think, in these paintings.
Do we have any more quick questions? No, you're right. I'll repeat your question. Okay. This one here. This one here. Here? Oh, this little girl. Yes.
Yes, that's a little girl. And if you look at the photographs of beach scenes of the period, sometimes they would pull their they'd pull their dresses up and tuck them into their into their drawers, or even I've seen whether they actually had, people talk about bathing drawers, whether they actually had these sort of canvas drawers that they tucked their petticoats into. Yes. Yes. And yes, and it was only for little girls. Ladies wouldn't have done that. And if you look at, say, photographs of Manly, photographs of Coogee, Australian postcards of the period, you often see Australian girls doing that. It's quite an ungraceful thing that all those petticoats, layers of petticoats, chemise and overdress being sort of tucked up into the drawers. But it was also possibly a way of keeping them out of the water and things like that. But
would you have been likely to see that on a French beach?
You'd certainly, if you go through the French beach scenes, you don't seem to see that. You don't seem to see that. And it's another thing, possibly it's another study to do, to go really carefully through the sets of beach scenes and to see the differing behaviours, because there's certainly the Manly beach is a lot more intermingling. But it's certainly, you see it documented in photographs of the period.
Yes, one more question. These two paintings? We know that they are of a similar size. And they're in the exhibition. They were, yes, they're both quite accomplished, paintings. We couldn't really say that one would be a study for the other painting. I think that they are both singular paintings in their own right. Would you agree?
Yes, I think this is what a lot of academic artists in France did, particularly the very popular ones. If a work sold, they would then make someone would pay them money to make a copy for it. And you may find, particularly with French salon works, you may find a copy. You may find one in a French collection. You may find one in an American collection. Possibly another one on the art market in a private collection. And particularly if a work was liked at the salon, getting back to what Georgina was saying, the salon was a broking place for artistic success and artistic commerce. And if it already had the magical red spot on it, if you were Mr. Vanderbilt, or if you were king of somewhere, king of Serbia, or the Emperor of Austria, and you liked that painting, you sent an agent to the artist's studio, and you'd commission a copy, and that was considered highly respectable. And it was a way that works that were admired, works that were successful, were often duplicated. And there are works, for example, like the Bouguereau in the Art Gallery of South Australia. I think there's another one of those. And sometimes you get, and art historians distinguish between copies, and these copies were not fakes. These were authorised copies, and they were seen as admirable. It was almost like one good painting, two good paintings is better. And it was seen almost as a validation. It was seen as a mark of success, and that people didn't see it as any lesser to have two. Some artists did quite a lot of changes. Some artists did mirror copies. So there's a whole lot of interesting art historical research done on these multiple paintings. But it was a way, we're talking about a slightly different artistic mores. And modernism, that whole idea of the artist's gesture, the authenticity, has intervened. We can't see these paintings with modernist eyes.
Okay.
I think that the thing that makes me wonder is there hanging up any of E. Phillips Fox's work? Are there other copies available? He also was involved. He tried to make money by offering to copy old masters from the Louvre. He wrote to all the galleries in Australia saying, okay, you can't. The American millionaires, even in 1900s, had made major paintings too expensive for Australian galleries to afford. But he said, I can do you very excellent copies. And in fact, Art Gallery of South Australia, they've bought that he was offering.
There is one in the Queensland Art Gallery. Yes. There's one in the National Gallery of Victoria's collection.
There's a Velasquez by Fox.
We know that money was never really plentiful in the Fox household, so there was always a need to sell. There was a need to kind of support themselves, both artists.
And that sort of makes us thinking of the costumes and things. Again, this dream of they represented high life, but they had to do it by being very careful and sort of economising, sharing Ethel's dresses with the studio and things like that. So it was always a constant sort of, it was a play of surfaces, a play of aplomb. It was a sort of, they were emulating a lifestyle that they hardly had the money to have. But I think the interesting thing is they committed themselves to living in Paris. They didn't want a bourgeois life. They didn't want a life of comfort. He didn't want to be a solicitor or a professional man like all his brothers, who were very comfortably off in Melbourne. And of course, the firm Phillips Fox is still one of Australia's most distinguished firms. That's come down from his brothers and his uncles.
Okay, well, I think that we should. Do we have one further question?
One more quick.
My question was directed toward Anne. With the painting that was recently re-authenticated or re-identified, in the case of a work like that where the working methods, the materials, the medium, everything is very difficult to tell apart, I'm just wondering, like, what's involved? I mean, is there a stylistic analysis? Is there an analysis of the draftsmanship? Or, I mean, obviously there's analysis as well about subject matter or the tendency to include certain objects in a painting, but I'm just wondering how would that operate on a kind of a formal level?
Well, I guess it's a very difficult process, and it's, as Angela said, it's probably not a process that's finite. It's it's always up for negotiation. It's the process of connoisseurship, and that involves looking at a lot of paintings. And I guess there are, in terms of science, you can look at the types of brush that the artists used. You can look at the brush strokes. You can look at whether one artist maybe was left-handed or right-handed. So you can see some differences there in the technique. But from from what I've looked at the paintings, it is, it can be difficult to distinguish, who's painted which painting. So really it comes down to research and looking at a lot of paintings, and I guess other historical factors. But I would say that it's a very fluid, process, and this is sort of where we're at the moment. But many paintings change attributions. So.
And we could also add that there is a first-hand recollection by Louise Porker, who was a nephew of the Foxes, a niece of the Foxes, and she can remember them sitting down with a paint box between them and a palette, and they were both painting almost from the same paints and the same colours, and they were sat side by side, and he said they'd even dab on each other's canvases. So there was a total, certainly around soon after their marriage, sort of 1905, 1907, 1908, there was almost there was a strong synergy between them, and they certainly did interchange, they shared resources and things like that. So it's.
But I just would say it is very unusual to have, it's very unusual to have two painters that, are so close. So that's what's fascinating about them.
Julie, I'll just make one comment. Isn't it the case that there's not another small marketplace by Phillips Fox of that size and subject? They all are equal.
That's right. It's really not it's not a subject that he that we have any other evidence that he really explored in that kind of scale, on that kind of level, and it's those kind of factors that you have to bring in when it's a serious thing to reattribute a painting, something that we considered very carefully, but just on the balance of evidence that there was nothing in Phillips Fox his works that we knew of that,
the scale
that
of
suggested
them,
that.
it's the same
yes,
size.
in the beach scenes, yes, but he didn't paint the markets in that way in any other kind of works that we've come across. I mean, perhaps we'll come across more that will change. We're always new works are always coming to light, and sometimes they change your entire perception of an artist, based on new works, coming out of private collections that haven't been seen before. I think that's a point to make about Ethel Carrick, is that, the works that we see in this exhibition are some indication of her practice, but there are many portraits, many more figure studies out there that I've found evidence of in exhibition catalogues that we just simply haven't seen. And there may very well be, there's many works in Europe, still in European private collections by her, that may transform our perspective of Ethel Carrick's works in the future.
Yes, the High Tide at St Malo is a very recent acquisition by the Art Gallery of New South Wales, acquired in 1909, and that's only very recently come out onto the art market, found in Europe, brought over by a major auction house, and that was a painting that's never been discussed by other art historians.
I suspect that there are more.
And it's a brilliant painting, a very proto-modernist, very geometrical, and.
Yes, there's another sketch in a private collection for that
and so
work.
this is the thing, particularly with Ethel, because people have almost had reduced the possibilities of what her art could be and came to her with very strong blinkers, that it's actually, there's a much richer oeuvre out there, and we're only just starting to discover what it's going to be, and we could do this show in 20 or 30 years' time, and there might even be a different interaction between the two. But I think this is one of the revelations of this is how strong she is, how authoritative the works are, when there's always been this assumption that they're interesting but lesser Emmanuel Phillips Fox works. There's always this idea that she's derivative, but I think they're neck and neck.
Okay, well, I think that's a good point to finish on. So thank you all for coming. I hope you come to...